Everyone, it's first chapter Fridays. Yay. So I'm gonna be reading a book from my Kindle today. It's called Odd and the Frost Giants by Neil Gaiman. It's about a boy who's a Viking and his story. So let's start. Odd and the Frost Giants. Chapter 1. Odd. There was a boy called Odd. There was nothing strange or unusual about that, not in that time or place. Odd meant the tip of a blade, and that was a lucky name. He was odd, though. At least the other villagers thought so. But if there was one thing that he wasn't, it was lucky. His father had been killed during a sea raid 2 years before, when Odd was 10. It was not unknown for people to get killed in sea raids, but his father wasn't killed by a Scotsman in dying glory and but his father wasn't killed by a Scotsman, dying in glory in the heat of battle as a Viking should. He had jumped overboard to rescue one of the stocky little ponies that they took with them on their raids as pack animals. They would load the ponies up with all the gold and valuables and food and weapons that they could find, and the ponies would trudge back to the long ship. The ponies were the most valuable and hardworking things on the ship. After Olaf the Tall was killed by a Scotsman, Odd's father had to look after the ponies. Odd's father wasn't very experienced with the ponies, being a woodcutter and woodcarver by trade, but he did his best. On the return journey, one of the ponies got loose during a squall off Orkney and fell overboard. Odd's father jumped into the grey sea with a rope, pulled the pony back to the ship, and, with the other Vikings, hauled it back up on the deck. He died before the next morning of the cold and the wet and the water in his lungs. When they returned to Norway, they told Odd's mother, and Odd's mother told Odd. Odd just shrugged. He didn't cry. He didn't say anything. Nobody knew what Odd was feeling on the inside. Nobody knew what he thought. And in a village on the banks of a fjord, where everybody knew everybody's business, that was infuriating. There were no full-time Vikings back then. Everybody had another job. Sea raiding was something that the men did for fun or to get things that they couldn't find in their village. They even got their wives that way. Odd's mother, who was as dark as Odd's father had been fair, had been brought to the fjord on a longship from Scotland. She would sing Odd the ballads that she had learned as a girl, back before Odd's father had taken her knife away and thrown her over his shoulder and carried her back to the longship. Odd wondered if she missed Scotland, but when he asked her, she said no, not really. She just missed people who spoke her language. She could speak the language of the Norse now, but with an accent. So here's a picture of Odd's father doing his job. Odd's father would sit by the fire and carve, making wood into faces and toys and drinking cups and bowls. Odd's father had been a master of the axe. He had a one-room cabin that he had built from logs deep in the little forest behind the fjord, and he would go out to the woods and return a week or so later with his hand cart piled high with logs, all ready to weather and to split, for they made everything they could out of wood in those parts. Wooden nails joined wooden boards to build wooden dwellings or wooden boats. In the winter, when the snows were too deep for travel, Odd's father would sit by the fire and carve, making wood into faces and toys and drinking cups and bowls, while Odd's mother sewed and cooked, and always sang. She had a beautiful voice. Odd didn't understand the words of the songs she sang, but she would translate them after she sung them, and his head would roil with the fine lords riding out on their great horses, their noble falcons on their wrists, brave hounds always padding by their sides, off to get into all manner of trouble, fighting giants and rescuing maidens and freeing the oppressed from tyranny. After Odd's father died, his mother sang less and less. Odd kept smiling, though, and it drove the villagers mad. He even smiled after the accident that crippled his right leg. It was 3 weeks after the longship had come back without his father's body. Ott had taken his father's tree cutting axe, so huge that he could hardly lift it, and hauled it out into the woods, certain that he knew all there was to know about cutting trees and determined to put this knowledge into practice. He should possibly, and he admitted this to his mother later, have used the smaller axe and a smaller tree to practice on. Still, what he did was remarkable. After the tree had fallen on his foot, he had used the axe to dig away the earth beneath his leg, and he pulled it out. He had cut a branch to make himself a crutch to lean on, for the bones in his leg were shattered, and somehow he had gotten himself home, hauling his father's heavy axe with him. For metal was rare in those hills, and axes needed to be bartered or stolen, and he could not have left it to rust. So 2 years passed, and Odd's mother married Fat Alfred, who was amiable enough when he had not been drinking. But he already had 4 sons and 3 daughters from a previous marriage. His wife had been struck by lightning, and he had no time for a crippled stepson. So Odd spent more and more time out in the great woods. Odd loved the spring, when the waterfalls began to course down the valleys and the woodland and was covered with flowers. He liked summer, when the first berries began to ripen, and autumn, when there were nuts and small apples. Odd did not care for the winter, when the villagers spent as much time they could in the village's great hall, eating root vegetables and salted meat. In the winter, men would fight and fart and sing and sleep and wake and fight again. And the women would shake their heads and sew and knit and mend. By March, the worst of the winter would be over. The snow would thaw and the rivers began to run, and the world would wake into itself again. Not that year. Winter hung in there, like an invalid refusing to die. Day after gray day, the ice stayed hard. The world remained unfriendly and cold. In the village, people got on one another's nerves. They had been staring at each other across the great hall for months now. It was time for the men to make the longship seaworthy. Time for the women to start cleaning around the ground for planting. Time for the women to start clearing the ground for planting. The games became nasty. The jokes became mean. Fights were to hurt. Which is why one morning at the end of March, some hours before the sun was up, when the frost was hard and the ground was still like iron, while Fat Alfred and his children and Odd's mother were still asleep, Odd put on his thickest, warmest clothes, stole a side of smoke-blackened salmon from where it hung in the rafters of Fat Alfred's house, and a fire pot with a handful of glowing embers from the fire, and he took his father's second best axe, which he tied to a leather thong on his belt, and limped out into the woods. The snow was deep and treacherous, with a thick, shiny crust of ice. It would have been hard walking for a man with 2 good legs, but for a boy with 1 good leg, 1 very bad leg, and a wooden crutch, every hill was a mountain. Odd crossed a frozen lake, which should have melted weeks before, and went deep into the woods. The days seemed almost as short as they had been in midwinter, and although it was only mid-afternoon, it was dark as night by the time he reached his father's old wood-cutting hut. The door was blocked by snow, and Odd had to take a wooden spade and dig it out before he could enter. He fed the fire pot with kindling and tended it until he felt safe transferring the fire into the fireplace, where the old logs were dry. On the floor, he found a lump of wood slightly bigger than his fist. He was going to throw it on the fire, but his fingers felt carving on the small wooden block, and so he put it to one side to look at it when it was light. He gathered snow in a small pan and melted it over the fire, and he ate smoked fish and hot berry water. It was good. There were blankets in the corner still and a straw stuffed mattress, and you can imagine that the little room smelled of his father. And nobody hit him or called him a cripple or an idiot. And so, after building the fire high enough that it would still be burning in the morning, he went to sleep quite happily. So that's the end of chapter 1 of Odd and the Frost Giant. So if you're interested, check that out. It's by an author called Neil Gaiman. He's one of my favorite authors. He writes um, a lot of fantasy books, a lot of really good stuff. There's books for children, books for young adults, and books for adults. So it's really good. Let me find a summary of the rest of the book, and we can do that. So Odd is a young Norseman whose father, a woodcutter, drowned during a Viking raid. His Scottish mother marries a fat widower who neglects him in favor of his own children. And soon after, the winter drags unnaturally long. Odd leaves his village for the forest. Um, let's see if there's a better summary. So here it is. An unlucky 12-year-old Norse An unlucky 12-year-old Norwegian boy named Odd leads the Norse gods Loki, Thor, and Odin in an attempt to outwit evil frost giants who have taken over Asgard. So there's some mythology in here, including Thor and Loki and Asgard. So if you're interested in any of that, I would highly suggest continuing to read Odd and the Frost Giants if you liked the first chapter. So there we go. Out in the frustrated. Cool. So I hope you're doing well. Stay safe. Wash your hands.